Welcome to Corporate Therapy, the podcast where we unpack the dumb stuff businesses do, we ask the big juicy questions, and then we chase down the answers. I'm Matt, your corporate plumber.
And I'm Rob, your leadership locksmith.
So today we're going to be exploring the topic of feedback and that nightmare. And I want to jump straight into it because even the topic makes me anxious to talk about, Rob. I mean, why does feedback come with a pucker factor of 10?
It's a fairly common thing in business, Matt, certainly for managers that are inexperienced with feedback. We're often worried about the fact that there's a real Goldilocks zone here. If we do it too softly, the person walks away and nothing changes. If we do it too bluntly, we might shut that individual down for the rest of their career. And often we end up, in front of the court of HR having to explain our actions.
Yeah, so HR plays a big role in this, and given your background in HR, I think it'll be exciting to tap into that as we go into this podcast today. But it just looks, when I take a step back and think about feedback, it is such a scary feeling, right, that you've got, and I appreciate you saying it's for inexperienced leaders. I'm some 30 years in and I still get nervous, but I reflect on what it felt like some 30 years ago where it just felt a lot easier to be able to get feedback, right? And I'm just conscious that these days it just feels like the environment around us is pretty much shaped to make it just damn hard to give feedback. Or am I just getting old and delusional?
No, I think you're right. I think, part of what made it seem easier 30 years ago might just have been the fact that we were inexperienced enough to not realize the importance of feedback, to not realize how horribly it could go wrong, or more importantly, how brilliantly it can go right when it's done well. So I think there is still an experience element there, but there's a lot going on in the world today that I think makes feedback much more difficult. The first of those is the fact that, when the COVID pandemic hit, we all started to move online. So we were remote working. And whereas that certainly gave us a little bit more control over our lives, it made giving feedback much, much harder because, to me anyway, it separates you a little bit from the nuance of it. It's difficult to read somebody's facial expressions. It's difficult to read somebody's body language. I know you can still see their face, but you can't see their toe tapping under the desk. You can't see their hand drumming away at their legs as they get nervous about what you're telling them. So those little nuances, I think, are really important.
But it's like back then we had I'm going to sit down and get face to face. Email had just come onto the scene, but now we've thrown so much digital channels at folks being as a way to communicate. I was reading somewhere, I was talking about that the written communication, though, via digital means is almost 3 times more likely to be interpreted as hostile. Is your thoughts on that?
In the absence of tone, people will make up their own. Yeah, there's an example that we use in communication skills training all the time. It's a single sentence with 6 words. I didn't say he stole it. If you put a different emphasis on a different word each time, you can get 6 completely different meanings from that sentence. I didn't say he stole it. That was Matt. I didn't say he stole it. I didn't say he stole it. I may have implied it. And so on. And that's just emphasis, which is a very, very small part of tone. So if you're reading an email and you don't have the tone of the person to work with, and not just an email, any sort of digital text-based communication, if you don't have the person's tone, you'll insert your own, or your mind will do it for you. And that often leads to massive misinterpretation.
Yeah. But interpretations, though, I think one is the channels. The other is we've got a lot more generations now hanging out in the workplace. Has that changed? Has that had any impact on feedback?
I think it does, and I think certainly with our generation, and I know we're very, very old men at this point, but with our generation, most of us wanted feedback that was sort of pretty straight to the point, pretty blunt. We could handle it, and it wasn't seen as personal. It was just business. And then I think, certainly later in my career, in my corporate career, a lot of businesses were putting themselves forward as, oh, it's kind of like working with a family here. I know I worked in organizations where I didn't just have colleagues, I had great friends. So there was an element of personal that came into it. And that came into feedback too. Not only do I have to manage a professional relationship with you now, but I've also got to work my way around a personal one. I was thinking about my dear old departed dad who worked in the General Post Office in Dublin. And if I had been talking to him about feedback, I think he'd have laughed. He'd have been just like, just tell me what you want me to bloody do and get it over and done with, There was none of that sort of personal vibe to it. And I think as we get later and later in the generations, there's more and more of that coming through. And I think that's something that we're really still trying to find a rhythm that works around.
Because it's funny, you talked about companies who say it feels like family or we are family. If it was feedback and family, in my case, it would probably be a slipper being thrown at somebody. So, I hope we learn not to operate like a family. But speaking of psychologically unsafe environments, let's talk about HR for a moment. This is where I look at the risks that have come into business. And as a manager, you're saying, okay, I want to be able to give an individual feedback. Sure. But then HR cottons on. It's like, hold on, we need to have a chat. What have you done? I'm really curious to get your take if HR is actually inhibiting good feedback from happening.
Yeah, I think it depends on the HR team in question, obviously enough. But one of the things that's interesting to me is I've heard a lot of people recently saying things like, HR is not there to protect the employee. It's there to protect the organization. Now, I think the important part of that is that progressive HR teams and good HR teams realize that the best way they can protect the organization is by protecting the employee. Yeah. However, feedback is a minefield, particularly if you don't really get the motivations behind giving that feedback. Again, it's open to interpretation, and people can take that the wrong way. I think there are some employees out there that see any sort of criticism at all as something that puts them straight into defensive mode. Yeah. Obviously, with feedback, we're often talking about constructive criticism. And I've seen some employees who have learned to weaponize things like a bullying claim. Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to minimize the very real bullying that happens in some organizations. However, some people have realized that if I get feedback that I don't like, I can just go, oh, I'm being bullied by my manager. And that will at least keep them at arm's reach for a while longer, so I can learn how to deal with that. Now, obviously, the vast majority of HR teams are hugely concerned about a bullying claim. It means best case scenario, having to spend a lot of time with somebody who is on leave with pay, doing an independent investigation, all of that sort of stuff. And it's a bit of a nightmare. But I think there are ways around that. I think there are ways that we can minimize the chances of that happening.
Well, let's lean into that. If we look at what good feedback looks like in a world where it's digitally mad, you're potentially working in a hybrid environment, HR 50-50 on which way they're going to go, and you've got a bunch of different generations there. What does good feedback now look like?
There's a couple of characteristics here that I think are really important. The first one, and I think one of the most important, is clarity. Just to be clear, we spend a lot of time muddying the waters by trying to make sure that we're spending more time managing the emotions of the person that we're giving the feedback to, rather than just giving them a clear message. And again, if you just gave them a clear message, the emotions are less likely to pop up in the first place. Yeah. So if they don't know exactly what they need to change, they can't fix it. But often we throw out these little vague, off-the-cuff comments, whether those are positive or negative, and the person has no idea what they're supposed to do with that information. I had a boss once who told me, just off the cuff, I need you to stop cracking jokes in serious meetings. And I was like, uh-oh, that's an integral part of my personality. I'm not sure I can change that, you know. Now, later on, he gave me much more specific feedback in relation to that, and it really stuck, and it really made a difference to me. But that being specific, that clarity, I think is really, really important.
You just talked on time there, Rob. Does time impact feedback in any way and being absorbed or not?
Absolutely, it does. Yeah, I've done a number of emerging leader programs, and we spend quite a lot of time talking about feedback in there. And one of the things that we talk about is the timeliness of the delivery of that feedback. I ask people in the classes all the time, who's a parent? And I get the occasional hand going up, and I'm like, right, so let me ask you this. You're in the supermarket with your child who's 2 or 3 years old, and they take a tin of beans off the shelf and they ping it down the middle of the aisle. Do you discipline them there and then, or do you wait 2 weeks? And everybody goes, well, of course you discipline them there and then. I'm like, yes, because you care about the kid. You don't want to see them repeat the bad behavior. So why don't you do the same with your employees? Why do I get so many leaders saying to me, oh, we're going to discuss it at my next one-on-one, which might not be for 2 weeks' time. So the timeliness of it is massively, massively important. Even if it's just a, hey, we're going to have a longer chat about this later, but, and you give them the sort of Cliff Notes version at the time, the timeliness is massively important.
Is there, though, a danger in that where as a leader, you're like, okay, I've just seen something that I want to be able to give them feedback on. Pucker factor kicks in. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I potato this? I haven't even chatted to HR yet. Like, what's your thoughts around that, though? Timeliness versus preparedness.
Yeah, so I think like with all skills, there's an element of experience and an element of practice to this. Yeah. So the way I would look at it is this. If you're practiced, if you have a simple framework, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, that you can apply to a situation, and you have a little bit of practice with that, you're much more likely to be able to deliver a very good feedback session off the cuff. Yeah.
Yep.
However, I would rather you delivered a mediocre feedback session there and then than waited to be polished later. Yeah. I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning. If my boss tells me about something I screwed up 2 weeks ago, the chances of me having any sort of a visceral connection with that in such a way that I might want to change are pretty slim. So I think with the experience, with a framework that you understand and you're practiced with, you should be able to deliver good feedback off the cuff. Even if you can't, I'd prefer to see you do a mediocre version at the time than wait 2 weeks and nail it.
What happens, though, if you've got a visceral kind of reaction yourself as a leader? Like you're at that point where they've done dumb potato moments that's absolutely gone in the space, or they've hurt somebody else, or they've gone off on the track, like it's gone against your values or something. And so there's a knee-jerk kind of reaction that you're wanting to have. What advice would you be giving to leaders who are kind of finding themselves in that space where they know on paper they need to be giving feedback now, or feedback as close to the moment as possible?
I think, we both have a little experience with managing anxiety, right? And I think when you have that kind of visceral reaction, when somebody does something that's contrary to your values, let's say, or they've done something, where they've thrown one of their colleagues under the bus or something like that, first acknowledge the fact that you're having an emotional reaction to it. And then do whatever it takes to get you out of that emotional reaction as quickly as you possibly can. We were talking in the corporate therapy community about box breathing. One of the things that I do when I get anxious is a thing called box breathing, where you breathe in for a count of 4, you hold it for a count of 4, breathe out for a count of 4, and hold it for a count of 4. In my most anxious moments, when I'm having panic attacks, box breathing has saved my ass on a number of occasions. So whatever it takes to ground you and to get you out of that anxious feeling, that heightened emotional state, so that you can deal with the feedback there and then, I think is really important. But there's also a piece about understanding your motivations. Why are you giving this person feedback? I start pretty much every feedback session, particularly if it's contentious, with The reason I'm giving you this feedback is because I care enough about you to want to see you succeed. I know I've mentioned that on the podcast previously.
Yeah.
But I will mention it on every episode if I get a chance, right? Because to me, that's what makes feedback stick, is when the person that you're delivering that feedback to understands that you care enough about them to want to see them succeed. If you didn't, you'd just let them shoot themselves in the foot, right? So you really need to realize that your job there is one of care, not necessarily of control.
I just want to dive into that care a little bit more, because you've got one team member, but you've also got others normally in your team as well.
Sure.
And so how do you kind of juggle care factor in that? Because as a leader, you're feeling that, oh, crikeys, how do I get us back to a point, a calibration where people want and do trust each other when I've got one individual who's on the deep end?
Yeah, so I think that's an important thing. You know, one of the things that needs to happen prior to feedback is for you to set behavioral expectations in the team. Yeah. And for them to set behavioral expectations with you. This is how I expect you to behave. Now, if those behavioral expectations don't line up, you have no business in that team. Yeah. And sometimes that's a tough pill to swallow. But most of the time, our behavioral expectations aren't unreasonable. Yeah. So when somebody's acting contrary to those, I've seen situations where you don't even need to give that person feedback because the rest of the team's done it for you. Hey, that's not how we operate around here. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but the team will often self-manage, particularly when it's behavioral and when the individual is doing something that's making the environment more toxic for the wider team. But if it's a behavioral expectation that's been breached by the individual, weirdly enough, that actually makes for a really easy feedback conversation. Hey, we had an agreement, you know.
Yeah.
We said that this was how we were going to operate. And I've noticed in any scenario that I've had to manage behavioral expectations like that, the response I get to the feedback is like, yeah, I know I screwed up. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. And they'll find their way back. Or they'll tell you the real reason behind why they acted the way that they did, which is might be something that's happening at home. They might be really stressed, whatever it is, but you'll often get to the real reason behind it.
Speaking of real reasons, I mean, you've touched there on the importance of care, and that's sounding a little bit more like motivation, which I know John Bradshaw, when he was commenting on the article, was talking about motivation was such an important part to identify, like, why do you want to actually give this feedback? Can you tell me a bit more about your take on that?
Yeah, I loved John's comment, and it sort of lines up with what I mentioned about I'm giving you this feedback because I care enough about you to want to see you succeed. If your motivation is anything other than I care enough about you to want to see you succeed, maybe you shouldn't be giving somebody feedback.
Yeah.
Maybe you should actually be finding them a new job, managing them out of your organization, whatever it is. You know, if your motivation is change in the individual, because you want to see them do well, then feedback's the right thing to do. If your motivation is telling this asshole what I think of them, there's a time and a place for that. It's 5:30 on a Friday. We call it the bar. I'm kidding, but you know what I mean. It's not a feedback conversation. So I think John's take on motivation was a really interesting one. You've really got to sit back and go, why am I doing this? And if it's anything other than I want to see this person change because I want to see them succeed, I care enough about them to want that to happen, well, then you've got to sit back and ask yourself a few hard questions. You know, you can also push it too far. There was one scenario that I had once where I learned a pretty hard lesson. I had 4 people that reported into me, and 3 of them were firing on all cylinders, and one of them wasn't. Now, the person in question was a wonderful facilitator, but he had a problem with consistency. We were trying to have a consistent approach across the country. Wanted to do their own thing all the time rather than get involved. So I gave some feedback, didn't work. I gave some more feedback, didn't work. Started a performance improvement plan. Then that person kind of got hostile. And I kept working away on, this is a simple thing to fix. I just need them to be consistent. I just need them to get on board with the rest of the team. And eventually, after a while of doing this, my boss pulled me aside and he went, it's time to let them go. And I was like, no, 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 I can fix them. We're almost there. And he was like, okay, it's your call. But if it was my call, I would be realizing in your shoes that I'm spending all of my time with one person who won't make a simple change. When you've got three people who are doing the very best that they can for you and you're giving them zero attention. And I just went, oh, wow. That was a hard learned lesson. Yeah. So, I had to change my motivation at that point. And I had to go, okay, my job now is to realize that this person doesn't want to change and to help them find a job or an organization where that sort of approach is more valued than here.
So you touched on earlier about approaches, like we've got some secret sauce that you've got there, Rob, on how to kind of structure feedback so it lands. Sure. I'm really keen to get your take on it because I appreciate there's a bunch of different models out there, but I think you've got one in particular that you enjoy using.
Yes. So I use this one called the BICA feedback model, or some people call it BICA. But it was introduced to me when I was working at Australian Hearing by Bianca Troy. She didn't come up with it. I don't know who did. I've been desperately trying to find out who did so I can give them a reference. So yeah, if you own the BICA model, let me know and we'll throw your name on it. But for me, this is, once you understand your motivations, if you can apply a simple framework that's easy for you to remember, easy to practice, and has a couple of very, very important little ideas in it, that works. So BICA stands for Behaviour, Impact, Consequence, Action. Yeah. So here's the behavior that I've observed. Yeah. And notice it's what I've observed, right? So it's non-judgmental. It's just, here's what I saw. Yeah. Then you tell them about the impact. And the impact is the impact that it has on the people around them, on the rest of their team, on the wider organization, perhaps even on the culture of the organization. What is the impact of that behavior? Then you talk to them about, the consequence. The consequence of that impact or of that behavior to them, and how it's holding them back in some way. And then finally, the A is action. What would you like to see them do differently next time? Yeah. The thing about this that's great is that, once you've done it a couple of times, it's pretty easy to get it right. Yeah. Once you've got a little bit of experience with it, it also allows you to sort of plan the conversation in advance if you've got the time to do that. So a feedback conversation, contrary to popular belief, is pretty much one way, right? It's me telling you, here's the behavior I observed, here's the impact that it has on the people around you, here's the consequences for you, and here's what I'd like to see you do differently. How does that sound? I give you an opportunity to respond at the end, but it's basically me talking to you rather than us having a two-way conversation. Now, that's the chance to respond comes, and we can have the two-way conversation afterwards. But that BICA model, you should be able to plan in advance to deliver. Yeah. I mentioned earlier that an old boss of mine told me I needed not to crack jokes in serious meetings. I went into my one-on-one with him at I think it was about a week later. And I just said, we had a decent relationship. So I said, hey, man, when you said I need to stop cracking jokes in serious meetings, that kind of shook me a bit, right? That's what I do. I make a joke to try and take a little bit of the edge off a heavy environment. And you're kind of asking me to change my personality a bit. And I need to understand that a little better. And he couldn't have been more BICA if he tried. Yeah. He went, Rob, listen, I notice that you sometimes crack jokes in serious meetings to try to take the edge off a heavy situation. So there's the observation of the behavior. Yeah. Yeah. Then he tells me about the impact. He goes, what I also see is that there are people around the room that are rolling their eyes and going, oh, here we go again. Rob with a stupid joke. Yeah. So he then goes into the consequence. He goes, what I'm nervous about is that your good, the way you put it was, your good advice and expertise is overlooked because people are rolling their eyes. Yeah. And when I heard good advice and expertise, that all of a sudden shifted the feedback a little more positive. If you can frame that consequence in a positive way, yeah, and make it come from a place of care about the individual, it hits much, much harder. Yeah. And then finally he said, so what I'd like you to do is either preempt it with, I don't mean to make light of the situation, but, or crack your joke, but crack it at the end of the meeting when everybody's going to their next one and they need to be a bit more positive for that. And that feedback landed for me. I was like, I would catch myself wanting to crack his stupid joke in a heavy meeting and go, nope, wait till the end. And I did notice that people were more focused on what I had to say when I wasn't making light of what was a heavy situation. So to me, that feedback really sticks if you can use that BICA model. It takes a little bit of practice, but it's not that difficult to get your head around.
So let's talk a bit more about that practice because, okay, those listening to the podcast, great, I've got a brand new model that's at this point, or a framework for me to practice. What is the safest, gentlest way for them to try it out?
So I have a cat. The only thing he's ever responded to my feedback was meow, but I can still practice on him, right? The cool thing about this BICA model is you can practice it solo, right? You're just practicing it in such a way where you're trying to be very clear about, here's the behavior I observed, here's the impact it has on other people, here are the consequences of that behavior for you, and here's the action you should take next time around. So you can monologue that into a mirror if you feel like it. You can talk to your cat when he's puked on the floor in protest for not being let out quickly enough. But the other thing is, we all have partners and friends and colleagues, and we give them feedback all the time, right? I think one of the most important things you can do is recognize an opportunity for feedback and then see if you can put this BICA model into effect on the fly. So I use every possible opportunity to give feedback. I mean, I've given feedback to a housemate before on how they load the dishwasher.
Do tell.
Well, so what I've noticed is that whereas I will load the dishwasher like I'm a Swedish architect, you will load it like you're a raccoon on meth. The impact on those around you is that it takes them a lot longer to unload the dishwasher because all of the things are in very different places. The consequence of this for you is maybe actually not a bad one. We don't want you to load the dishwasher anymore. So what I'd like to see you do in the future is load it like a Swedish architect, put all the forks together and all the knives together and all the spoons together so I can just grab a handful of those and put them in the cutlery drawer. It doesn't have to be anything complicated, right? Yep. It can be something that you like or you don't like. Bear in mind, you can also use this BICA model for very positive feedback. The behavior I've noticed is this. The impact it has on your team is that they're all delighted to have you around. The consequence for you is that you're becoming somebody who's really trusted. And the action I'd like to see is for you to do more of that. So it's a simple model. It's pretty easy to practice solo, on a cat, on a roommate, on just about anybody that you can. And with a little bit of practice, it becomes very, very easy to do it on the fly. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of the leaders I've introduced this to will tell me that's been the highlight of the course for them. Yep. That feedback model saved my ass on so many occasions. I still hear people talking about it years later. And to me, that's testament to the fact that it's a simple model that works.
So let's tap into the anxious hamster where it's like, but. And so I read through some of the comments from folks as to the things that they were nervous on. And the first one was like, I actually do care about the other person. I'm really worried the moment I give them this feedback, our relationship is just going to be forever changed for the worse. What's your take on that?
So the first thing I would say about that is that if somebody has a bad reaction to your feedback, you can't control that, right? Yeah. If they've decided that they just don't like your criticism and it is going to destroy a friendship or whatever, there's nothing you can do to control that. Their reactions are their own. Yeah. So accept that first. Yeah. However, what you can do is influence as much as you possibly can to make that kind of reaction less likely. So for me, with the the fact that if you're worried about if this hurts the relationship means you've already got your motivations worked out. You're already coming from a place of care. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what you want to do is really lean into that care more so than the critique, if that makes sense. I care about you enough to want to see you succeed, or I care about our working relationship, and that's why I want to talk openly with you.
But what if the participant, the person you're trying to give feedback to, or the recipient, has zero F's to give? Like, hey, that's fine. I don't want to take this on. Or worse, they get defensive and start fighting back, not physically, but
yeah. So if somebody gets defensive, trust your intuition on it a little bit.
Oh.
Yeah. If they get defensive and you can understand why they might be getting defensive on it, if you see something that in them that where you go, actually, this might be challenging their very personality. It might be challenging something that they hold dear. Yeah. Give them space. Yeah. Let them respond. Yeah. And try to turn it from an adversarial interaction into one of collaboration, right? So use we a lot. Yeah. Talk about, let's work through this together. Yeah. You want that person to see you as an ally, to understand your care factor, rather than somebody who's an adversary in this particular thing. So if they get defensive, give them space to respond, and see if you can get them into a collaborative mindset. I think that'd be the best way to handle that.
But I think the other one, though, is like I hear a lot from managers, I don't have time.
Yeah. And I have the same reaction, which is really, if you don't have time for this, what are you doing in a leadership role, right? The thing that, what I find when most people say, I don't have time, is what they mean is, I don't have time in the short term.
Yeah.
I don't have time right now. I've got some sort of other thing over here that's on fire that I need to deal with. Yeah. And they're moving from crisis to crisis. Yeah. What those people often don't realize is that you've got to spend a little bit of time now to save a lot of time later. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for example, I had a team of 4 reporting into me, and I had 4 little notebooks, and each notebook had their name written on it. Yes, I'm old school. I used pen and paper. And every time we had a one-on-one or a feedback session or a coaching session, I'd just make a few notes and put a time and a date on it.
Yeah.
That saved me a massive amount of time in 2 ways. One was that when it came time to complete mid-year and end-of-year performance reviews, most people have, at an end-of-year performance review, most people have 12 months worth of work to look back over. Yeah. I didn't, because I was doing almost like a mini performance review in a one-on-one each month. I had the notes there, so I just had another month's worth of work to do, and my performance review was taken care of. So I was taking about 1/12 of the time of other leaders to do my performance review. The other way that it saved me a lot of time was when one of my employees decided to use bullying as a way to get out of a performance improvement plan. I was accused of bullying, and I was asked by an independent investigator to include any evidence I had that this was not the case, and I handed over my notebook. And when it came back that I was exonerated, I asked why, and he said, "Well, you provided 51 pages of evidence, whereas the person in question provided a paragraph to say they thought you were a bully." So you can imagine the amount of time that it would have cost me to troll back through all of that evidence and try to work it out. What I did was hand over a notebook.
On that note, how did you feel during that time, that whole period, though?
Oh, stressed to death. Yeah. And how could you not be? Because you've got somebody who, well, firstly, in my case, I knew that I had done nothing to even worry about being that accusation sticking in any way.
Yeah.
However, the more you think about it, that there's like, oh, well, maybe when I said that, maybe they took that the wrong way. And you start to second guess yourself. So you're stressed to death. Yeah. But, there were some other circumstances there that made me a little less worried about it, in that this person had accused previous managers of bullying as well. So I tried to rationalize my way out of it. But it was a scary time. It would have been much, much scarier, and this is the bit that most leaders miss, if I was scrambling to try to find the evidence that I was a good manager rather than just handing over a notebook. Yeah.
Would it have been easier to have never given feedback though in the first place?
Yeah. For me, it would have. But I had a team that went from being monstrously dysfunctional when I inherited them to firing on all cylinders by the time I left them. So it would have been easier for me. It probably would have been easier for the person in question. But there were 3 other members of that team that we took from just being at each other's throats 24 hours a day to being a cohesive team that was kicking some serious goals. They've all gone on to bigger and better things now. But yeah, so would it have been easier? Yeah, again, if you're looking at it in the short term. And I think this is one of the problems with feedback, is that we have this short-term focus on it. We need to think longer. What you're trying to do here is create the team that people are talking about 15 years after they left it,
And on that bombshell, I think that's a wonderful place for us to wrap up today's podcast there, Rob. We have learned that feedback doesn't need to come with the pucker factor, and BICA might be better than biscuits. So, Rob, over to you. What's your closing words for today?
Feedback's practically a superpower. If you can nail this, what you're going to end up with is teams that talk about how awesome it was to work there 15, 20 years later. I know that because I've been in teams like that myself, and I've managed a couple along the way. When it's done well, it changes people's work, it changes their career, it even changes their lives. So the next time that you need to give feedback and the anxious hamster kicks in, think about the folks that helped you to get to where you are today. Don't wait to craft perfect words. Have a clear intention with heart. I think that's a really important thing to do. You're in a human relationship here, and it's important to allow the emotion into it while keeping the clarity there too.
And speaking of important, remember to subscribe, to share. Join us next time in an episode where we tackle the messy stuff in business. Remember, you've got this.
Stay curious, folks.